A man looking for a simple piece of wood is about to uncover a secret so dark it has its own graveyard. And once he opens that door, there's no going back. For him or for you. Sterling Maddox was a timberman through and through. He knew the language of the forest, the groan of a falling pine, the sharp scent of sap that meant a tree was ready. He'd spent his life in the remote valleys of the West, a place where civilization was a distant rumor, and a man's survival depended on the strength of his own two hands and the edge on his axe. He thought he'd seen it all. He'd seen men crushed by falling redwoods, seen winter starvation turn good neighbors into hollow-eyed ghosts. He'd seen the casual cruelty of nature and the desperate cruelty of man. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared him for what he was about to find, chained up behind Amos Thatcher's outhouse. The morning was cold, the kind of damp chill that seeps right into your bones. A thick mist clung to the pines, making the whole world feel silent and secret. Sterling guided his wagon down the narrow rutted trail leading to the Thatcher place. His best axe handle, a piece of seasoned hickory he'd had for 10 years, had finally given up the ghost the day before, splitting clean in two. In this part of the country, a broken tool wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Winter was sniffing at the door, and no axe meant no timber meant no money, and no money meant an empty belly and a cold hearth. Word was, old Amos Thatcher had the best hickory for miles. The Thatcher Ranch was tucked away in a valley so deep and isolated, it felt like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. The kind of place where secrets could fester. Sterling had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. They said Amos had gone sour after his wife died years ago, that his heart had turned as bitter and black as burnt coffee. They said he kept to himself, that he didn't welcome visitors. But stories were just campfire talk. Sterling needed that wood. He wasn't there to make friends. As he pulled his wagon into the main yard, an unnatural quiet settled over him. It was too still. A working ranch, even one run by a single man, should have noise. The cluck of chickens, the bark of a dog, the nicker of a horse. But here, nothing. Just the whisper of the wind through the pines and the unsettling feeling of being watched. "Hello?" Sterling called out, his voice sounding loud and out of place in the dead air. Only the echo answered back. He swung down from his wagon, his boots crunching on the gravel. The main house looked tidy enough, but the windows were dark, like vacant eyes. A deep sense of wrongness prickled the back of his neck. This wasn't just a quiet ranch. This was a dead ranch. He was about to turn around, to decide that maybe the trip wasn't worth the trouble, that he'd take his chances with a lesser piece of wood from somewhere else. And that's when he heard it. It was so faint at first he thought he'd imagined it. A tiny muffled sound, like an animal caught in a trap, trying its best not to make a noise. A soft, rhythmic whimper. It was a sound of pure misery, and it drew him in against his better judgment. He followed it around the back of the house, his hand resting on the hilt of the hunting knife at his belt. He passed an empty corral, its gates swinging on a single rusty hinge, and headed toward the small, weathered outhouse that stood near the edge of the woods. The whimpering got stronger as he got closer, more desperate, more human. Sterling's heart started to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Every instinct he had, every lesson the wilderness had ever taught him about avoiding trouble, was screaming at him to turn back, to get in his wagon and ride away as fast as he could. But the sound came again, a broken little plea that snagged something deep inside him. He reached the outhouse door, his hand hesitating over the simple wooden latch. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that opening this door was a mistake, that whatever was on the other side would change his life forever. He pulled the door open, and the world fell away. For a long moment, his mind simply refused to process what he was seeing. Huddled in the far corner, amidst the filth and the shadows, was a person, a young woman, though it was hard to tell. Her dress was nothing more than a collection of rags, her hair a tangled, matted mess. She was painfully thin, her limbs like sticks, her skin covered in a layer of grime and old bruises. But it was the chain that made his breath catch in his throat. A thick, rusted iron chain was clamped around her ankle. The other end bolted directly into the wooden wall with a heavy iron ring. She flinched when the daylight hit her, scrambling back against the wall like a cornered animal. She looked up at him, and her eyes were a bottomless well of terror and despair. They were the eyes of someone who had forgotten what hope felt like, who expected nothing from the world but more pain. When she spoke, her voice was a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of vocal cords that had forgotten how to be used. "Please," she croaked, "don't tell him you saw me." Sterling stumbled back, his mind reeling, trying to make sense of the horror in front of him. This wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just cruelty. This was a monster's work. A father keeping his own daughter chained up like livestock in an outhouse. The shackle had rubbed her ankle raw, a bloody, infected wound that spoke of years of captivity. He knelt, his stomach churning, to get a closer look at the bolt in the wall, wondering how he could possibly pry it loose. And that's when he heard the heavy, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the dead leaves behind him. A voice as cold and flat as a tombstone cut through the morning air. "Well, well, looks like the cat's out of the bag." Sterling rose slowly, turning to face the man who had just walked around the corner of the house. It was Amos Thatcher. He was a tall, gaunt man with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the rain. There was no shame in his eyes, no flicker of regret. Just the cold, flat irritation of a man whose routine had been disturbed. And in his hands, held loosely but ready, was a long-barreled rifle. "You got no business poking around back here, Lumberjack," Amos said, his voice a low growl. "Some things are private family matters." Sterling's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He glanced back at the girl, who he now presumed was Maggie, Amos's daughter. She had pressed herself into the corner, trying to become invisible. The sheer terror radiating from her was a physical force. "That's your daughter," Sterling said, his voice tight with a rage he was struggling to control. "That's my business," Amos corrected him, taking a step closer. The rifle wasn't pointed at Sterling. Not yet. But the threat hung between them, as thick and heavy as the morning mist. "Maggie, she ain't been right in the head. Not since her mother passed. Gets these wild spells. Violent. This," he gestured with the rifle barrel toward the outhouse, "this is for her own safety. Keeps her from hurting herself or others." "Safe?" The word tasted like acid in Sterling's mouth. He looked at Maggie, at her skeletal frame, at the raw wound on her ankle, at the dead hope in her eyes. This wasn't safety. This was torture. "She's skin and bones, Amos," Sterling shot back. "When was the last time she had a proper meal?" Amos shrugged, a gesture of profound indifference. "She gets what she needs, more than she deserves, truth be told." He lowered his voice, a conspiratorial whisper that made Sterling's skin crawl. "Truth is, the girl was born wrong, flawed. You can see it in her face. Not right to look at. An embarrassment. Her mother, she coddled her. But after she was gone, I had to take matters into my own hands. Keep the ugliness contained." The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. Ugliness. He looked at Maggie again, truly looked at her. Her features were unconventional, yes. A strong jaw, a prominent nose, eyes set a little too wide. In a world that valued delicate symmetry, she might be called plain. But her father's disgust had twisted that perception into something monstrous in his own mind. Sterling, however, saw something else entirely. Beneath the layers of dirt and fear, he saw an intelligence in those wide-set eyes. He saw a flicker of a spirit that, impossibly, hadn't been completely extinguished. "You're going to unlock that chain," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. Amos actually laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound, like stones grinding together. "The hell I am. You're going to get back on your wagon, ride out of this valley, and you're going to forget every single thing you saw here today. It's for the best. For everyone." The rifle started to rise, its dark muzzle looking like a bottomless pit. Sterling's mind raced, calculating the distance. He was too far away to rush the man, too close to run without getting a bullet in the back. But then Maggie whimpered again, a sound of utter hopelessness, and it solidified his resolve. He wasn't leaving. He couldn't. "I came here to buy hickory," Sterling said, his voice steady, trying to de-escalate, to buy himself a precious few seconds to think. And now you're thinking about leaving with something that ain't yours, Amos countered, his finger tightening on the trigger. See, the problem you got, Lumberjack, is that you saw, and what you saw could ruin my standing. My reputation in town. I'm a respected man, a grieving widower, just trying to manage. Can't have folks thinking otherwise. Sterling finally understood. This wasn't just about hiding a daughter he was ashamed of. This was about protecting a carefully constructed lie. Amos had likely told the folks in Cedar Falls that his daughter had run off, or died from a fever. A man who could chain up his own flesh and blood in an outhouse was a man capable of any deception, and any violence required to maintain it. People know I came here, Amos, Sterling said, choosing his words with care. If I don't come back, the sheriff will come looking. A cold smile touched Amos's thin lips. Maybe, but who are they going to believe? Me? Or the story I tell them, that a drifter tried to rob me and I had to defend my property? A man's got a right to protect his home. The standoff stretched, the silence broken only by the cawing of a distant crow. Sterling could feel Maggie's eyes on him. He wondered how many times this had happened before. How many other lost travelers or merchants had stumbled upon the same horrifying scene? Had any of them tried to intervene? Or had they all made the sensible choice, turned around and left this girl to her fate? Not him. He'd made his choice the second he saw that chain. He had to get Amos talking, to find an opening. Any opening. Tell me something, Amos, Sterling said, taking a tiny, almost imperceptible step to his left, changing the angle just slightly. How long you been keeping her like this? Since her mother died? Long enough to know what's best, Amos snapped, his eyes narrowing. And in all that time, Sterling pressed, am I really the first person to stumble back here by mistake? A flicker of something crossed Amos's face. Annoyance. Uncertainty. It was the crack in the facade Sterling had been hoping for. Amos was confident, but he wasn't invincible. He was a man with a secret, and secrets make men nervous. But before Sterling could make his move, a small, trembling voice cut through the tension like a razor. It was Maggie. He's lying, she whispered, her voice stronger than before. You're not the first one. Amos's head whipped around toward the outhouse. Shut your mouth, girl. You don't know nothing. But it was too late. Finding an unexpected ally had ignited a tiny spark of courage in Maggie. She pushed herself up straighter, her eyes fixed on Sterling. There were others, she said, her voice gaining volume with every word. They found me, just like you. The air turned thick and cold. Sterling felt a knot of ice form in his gut. Others. The traveling preacher, Maggie continued, her words coming faster now, a torrent of truth held back for years. He came by last spring, looking for a donation for his new church. He heard me crying. He said he was going to get the sheriff. Her eyes darted to a spot near the old gnarled oak tree at the edge of the yard. He never left the ranch. Amos's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. I told you to shut your mouth, he roared, taking a step toward her. And the cattle buyer, Maggie cried out, ignoring him, her gaze now locked with Sterling's, desperate to make him understand. He came in the summer to look at the herd. His wagon broke an axle. He came back here looking for a tool. He saw me. He promised he'd come back for me. She pointed a trembling finger toward a patch of disturbed earth near the creek bed. Papa told him the same lies he's telling you. And then he took him down to the creek. The pieces didn't just fall into place. They slammed together with the force of a coffin lid. The isolation, the unnatural quiet, the immediate threat of murder. This wasn't Amos Thatcher's first time silencing a witness. This ranch wasn't just a prison. It was a graveyard. How many? Sterling asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Amos turned back to face him, the facade of the grieving father completely gone. What stared back at Sterling was a predator, a monster stripped bare. He smiled, a terrifying, humorless baring of teeth. Enough, he snarled. Enough to know that a hole in the ground solves a lot of problems. The rifle barrel swung towards Sterling's chest with practiced speed, but years of felling giant trees had given Sterling reflexes as sharp as his axe blade. He didn't think. He just moved. He dove to the side, hitting the dirt and rolling as the rifle exploded, the sound ripping through the quiet morning. The bullet tore through the air where his heart had been a second before and slammed into the outhouse wall, showering Maggie with splinters. Sterling scrambled behind a stone water trough, his mind racing. It was a single-shot rifle, an old one. That meant Amos had to reload. It was a slow process, but it wouldn't take him more than 10 seconds. 10 seconds to live or die. You should have just walked away, Lumberjack. Amos shouted, his voice filled with rage as he frantically worked the rifle's action, fumbling for a new cartridge. Could have been simple. Now it's just gonna be messy. Sterling risked a peek around the edge of the trough. Amos was using the corner of the main house for cover, his eyes scanning for a clear shot. But from that angle, he couldn't see inside the outhouse. And Sterling saw something he hadn't noticed before, something that made his heart leap with a desperate, wild hope. The iron ring holding Maggie's chain. Years of her pulling, testing, struggling against her confinement had taken their toll. The wood around the bolt was rotten, splintered. The ring was loose. It was still holding, but just barely. One good hard yank might be enough to pull it free. "Maggie!" Sterling called out, his voice a harsh whisper, praying it wouldn't carry to her father. "The chain! In the wall! Can you pull it?" He saw her look at the bolt, then back at him. Understanding dawned on her face. She grabbed the chain with both hands and pulled. The iron ring shifted in the rotten wood, groaning in protest. Hope, a thing she hadn't felt in a decade, flickered across her features. But then came the click, the final damning sound of a rifle being reloaded. "Time's up, stranger," Amos growled from behind the house. "Say your prayers." Sterling had two choices. He could stay behind the trough where he was relatively safe and hope to wait Amos out. Or he could make a run for it, hoping to get to the woods before Amos could draw a bead on him. He chose a third option. In a single fluid motion, Sterling exploded from behind the cover, not away from the fight, but directly into it. He sprinted toward the outhouse, toward Maggie, toward the only chance either of them had. The world seemed to move in slow motion. He saw the surprise on Amos's face, the rifle swinging around to track him. He heard the crack of the second shot, felt the searing heat as the bullet tore through the fleshy part of his arm, a white-hot poker of pain. But he didn't stop. He slammed into the outhouse, ignoring the agony, and grabbed the loose end of Maggie's chain with both hands. "When this comes free," he gasped, blood already soaking his sleeve, "you run for my wagon. You get in and you whip those horses until they fly. Don't stop. Don't look back. Do you understand me?" She stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She nodded. "Go!" Sterling planted his feet, grit his teeth against the fire in his arm, and threw every ounce of his strength, his rage, and his desperation into one monumental pull. The rotten wood shrieked, the metal groaned, and then, with a sound like a gunshot, the entire assembly, ring, bolt, and a chunk of splintered wall, ripped free. Maggie was free. But as she stumbled out into the daylight for the first time in years, blinking against the sudden brightness, Amos Thatcher was rounding the corner of the house. He had a fresh cartridge in his rifle, murder in his eyes, and nothing left to lose. And Sterling was about to find out that a man with no secrets left to hide is the most dangerous animal of all. Maggie's legs, weakened from years of disuse, buckled beneath her. She fell to the ground, tangled in the length of chain that was still shackled to her ankle. Sterling lunged, grabbing her arm to haul her to her feet, but there was no time. Amos was there, a figure of pure malice, the rifle already rising to his shoulder, the aim steady and sure. "Run!" Sterling screamed, shoving Maggie with all his might toward the wagon. He then spun around, his eyes desperately searching for a weapon, anything to defend them. His gaze landed on a rusted, heavy-headed shovel leaning against the outhouse wall. He snatched it up just as the rifle boomed for a third time. This time, the bullet found its mark. It slammed into his shoulder, spinning him around like a top. The impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer, a blinding explosion of white-hot pain that stole his breath and sent him crashing to one knee. The shovel clattered to the ground. For a second, the world went gray, the edges of his vision tunneling to a pinpoint. But through that tunnel, he heard Maggie scream. Not a scream of fear for herself, but for him. She had stopped running. She was turning back. "No!" he roared, the sound tearing from his throat. "Keep going!" Rage, pure and undiluted, surged through him, a fire that burned hotter than the agony in his shoulder. He would not die here. He would not let this monster win. He would not let this girl be dragged back into that filthy prison. He forced himself back to his feet, his vision swimming. He swayed, but he stood. He scooped up the shovel, the heavy wood and iron feeling impossibly heavy in his one good hand. Blood was pouring down his chest, but his legs were still under him. It would have to be enough. Amos was advancing slowly, methodically, a sick grin spreading across his face. He was enjoying this. He was savoring the victory he believed was already his. "Should have minded your own business, Lumberjack," he sneered, working the bolt on his rifle, preparing for the final killing shot. "Now you're just another secret to be buried, just like the others." The others. The preacher. The cattleman. How many more? The thought fueled Sterling's fury. He took a staggering step forward, not back. He spat a mouthful of blood and dirt onto the ground. "How many men did you murder, Amos?" he growled, raising the shovel like a club. "How many did you kill to hide your shame?" Amos let out a short, bitter laugh. "Shame? You call it shame. I call it pruning. The world is full of imperfect things, weak things, ugly things. A man has a right to keep his own garden clean." His eyes flicked past Sterling to where Maggie stood, frozen in terror by the wagon. "Look at her. You think any man would want that? You think she could ever be a proper wife? Have proper children? I did the world a favor. I did her a favor. Nobody wants to see a face like that." Sterling's vision went red. The pain in his shoulder vanished, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. The shovel suddenly felt as light as a feather. "The only ugly thing I see here," he whispered, "is you." He charged. He closed the distance between them in 3 long, stumbling strides. Amos, surprised by the sudden assault from a man he'd thought was finished, tried to bring the rifle to bear, but he was too slow. Sterling was too close. With a primal roar, Sterling swung the heavy shovel with every last ounce of strength in his body. The curved steel edge connected with the side of Amos Thatcher's head with a sickening, wet crack, a sound like a heavy piece of wood splitting under pressure. Amos's eyes rolled back in his head, his body went limp, and he crumpled to the ground like a sack of grain. The rifle fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering uselessly in the dirt. He was alive, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths, but he wasn't getting up anytime soon. Sterling dropped the shovel and staggered toward the wagon, his job done. Maggie was still standing there, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide. But she wasn't looking at her father's unconscious form. She was looking at Sterling, and her expression wasn't one of fear or disgust at the violence she'd just witnessed. It was one of pure, unadulterated disbelief. You came back for me," she whispered, the words barely audible, as if the concept was so foreign, so impossible, that she couldn't comprehend it. "Of course I did," Sterling grunted, the adrenaline starting to fade, allowing the pain to come screaming back. He leaned heavily against the wagon, his knees threatening to buckle. "Nobody deserves that. Nobody." Her eyes, which had been so dry and empty, suddenly filled with tears. The first tears, he suspected, she had allowed herself to cry in a very, very long time. "But look at me," she said, her voice choked with a lifetime of shame that had been beaten into her. "He was right. I'm everything he said. I'm ugly, worthless. Why would you risk your life for someone like me?" Sterling pushed himself off the wagon. He reached out with his good hand, the one not covered in his own blood, and gently, so gently, he touched her cheek, his thumb wiping away a smudge of dirt. He looked past the grime, past the fear, past the features her father had taught her to hate, and he saw the person underneath. He saw the fierce spirit that had whispered the truth about the others. He saw the courage that was just now beginning to awaken. He saw the profound kindness in a soul that had only ever been shown cruelty. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" he asked, his voice soft. She flinched but didn't pull away. "I see someone who survived hell and didn't let it turn her into a monster like him. I see someone who warned me about the others, who tried to save my life, even when she was terrified for her own. I see strength you don't even know you have." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I see someone beautiful." She stared at him, utterly speechless, as if he'd just spoken in a language from a different planet. The tears flowed freely now, washing clean streaks down her dirty cheeks. "You're hurt," she finally managed to say, her gaze dropping to his bleeding shoulder. "You're hurt because of me." "I'm hurt because of him," Sterling corrected her firmly. "Not you, never you." He glanced back at Amos's still form. They had time, but not much. Sooner or later, he would wake up. Or worse, someone else might arrive. The truth of what happened on this ranch needed to be brought into the light. All of it. "We need to get to town," Sterling said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "We need to tell the sheriff what happened here. People need to hear your story." Maggie's head snapped up, a fresh wave of panic in her eyes. "No, they won't believe me. They'll believe him. He's told them all for years that I was sick in the head, that I was dangerous. They'll take one look at my face and they'll agree with him. They'll say I'm crazy. They might even lock me up somewhere else." "Then they'll have to go through me first," Sterling said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let them look at your face, and then let them look at mine, and they'll see someone who was worth fighting for." He helped her into the wagon, his body screaming in protest with every movement. He climbed up beside her, the world swaying dangerously for a moment before it steadied. He took the reins in his good hand. As he did, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Not since he was a young man with a heart full of dreams. He felt a sense of purpose. It was a dangerous feeling, but a good one. Behind them in the dirt, Amos Thatcher began to stir. His eyes fluttered open just in time to see the wagon carrying his daughter, his secret, his shame, rumbling down the trail, away from him, toward the town, toward the truth. A raw, guttural roar of pure, impotent rage echoed through the valley. But it was too late. His control was broken. His secret was out. For the first time in her adult life, Maggie was free. But as the Thatcher ranch disappeared behind them, Sterling had a sinking feeling that their fight for survival was very far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The wagon wheels churned through the mud and rock of the trail, every jolt sending a fresh wave of searing pain through Sterling's shoulder. He was pushing the horses hard, harder than he ever had before, a desperate urgency coiling in his gut. He could feel himself weakening, the loss of blood making his vision swim and his good hand tremble on the reins. Behind them in the distance, a thin column of black smoke was beginning to rise from the direction of the ranch. A signal. Amos was awake, and he was calling for help. Maggie sat beside him, rigid as a statue, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She kept shooting terrified glances back down the trail, as if she expected to see her father's monstrous form appear at any moment, ready to drag her back into the darkness. "He's coming," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "He's not going to let us get away. He always told me if I ever tried to run, he'd hunt me down and make me wish I'd never been born." "Let him try," Sterling gritted out, his teeth clenched against the pain. "This time, you're not alone." But even as he said the words, a cold dread was seeping into him. He knew these mountains, but Amos had been born and raised in them. He knew every shortcut, every hidden trail. He had fresh horses. He had allies who thought he was a respectable rancher. And most importantly, with his darkest secret now exposed, he had absolutely nothing left to lose. They were a wounded man and a terrified girl in a slow-moving wagon. Amos was a desperate monster with a thirst for vengeance. The odds were not in their favor. The town of Cedar Falls was still an hour away, an hour that felt like an eternity. And then they heard it, the sound every fugitive fears, the distant rhythmic thunder of approaching hooves. And it wasn't just one horse, it was several moving fast. "He found people," Maggie breathed, her face draining of all color. He's telling them lies. He's telling them I'm a lunatic who attacked him and that you're a drifter who kidnapped me. They'll believe him. They always believe him. Sterling's jaw tightened. She was right. It was the perfect story. A pillar of the community, a grieving widower, attacked in his own home. Who would ever believe the rambling, insane-sounding tale of a chained-up girl and a blood-soaked stranger? They weren't riding to a rescue. They were riding into a trap. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Voices carried on the wind, sharp and commanding. "In the name of the law, pull up that wagon." Sterling's heart sank like a stone. He recognized that voice. It was Sheriff Wade Langston, a man he'd always known to be fair, if a bit lazy. But what was he doing riding with Amos? Unless the rot in the Thatcher family went deeper than just one man. "It's the sheriff," Maggie whimpered, tears starting to stream down her face again. "He's with him. Oh God, he's with him. We're done for." The posse was gaining on them, maybe a dozen riders, with Amos and the sheriff at their head. They were trapped. To stop meant letting Amos get his hands on Maggie again, a fate worse than death. To keep running meant getting shot in the back by the law. Sterling looked at Maggie's terrified face, at the raw hope he'd seen in her eyes just a short time ago, now being extinguished by a lifetime of fear. And in that moment, he made a decision. A reckless, desperate decision that would either be their salvation or their doom. He yanked hard on the reins, pulling the horses sharply to the left, steering the wagon off the main trail and onto a narrow, barely there path that cut straight into the rocky maw of a steep canyon. It was an old logging trail he'd used once or twice, treacherous and unforgiving, barely wide enough for the wagon. It was also their only chance. "Hold on!" he yelled to Maggie over the crashing and groaning of the wagon. "This is going to get rough." The wagon lurched violently as its wheels hit the rocky ground, throwing them both against their seats. Behind them, the posse reined in their horses at the canyon entrance, shouting in surprise and confusion. Sterling could hear them arguing. Some were yelling that it was too dangerous, that the canyon was a death trap. But then Amos Thatcher's voice, raw with fury, cut through the debate. "She's in there. That madman has my little girl. We go in after them, or we lose them for good." The sound of hooves clattering on rock behind them told Sterling all he needed to know. Amos's desperation was infectious. He was willing to risk every man's life to get Maggie back, to silence her forever. The trap wasn't behind them anymore. The trap was the canyon itself, and its stone jaws were closing in around them. The canyon walls rose up on either side of them like jagged stone teeth, blotting out the afternoon sun and plunging them into a world of gray rock and deep shadow. The wagon bucked and swayed, threatening to splinter apart with every rock and rut. Sterling fought the reins, his wounded shoulder screaming with every jarring impact, his vision starting to blur at the edges. Behind them, the posse was struggling. The narrow, treacherous path was not meant for riders in a hurry. Sterling heard a man curse as his horse stumbled, the clatter of falling stones, and then a shout of pain as at least one of the riders was thrown from his saddle. But they kept coming, driven onward by Amos's relentless, hate-filled pursuit. "It's no good," Maggie said, her voice hollow, devoid of hope. "This canyon, it doesn't go through. It dead ends at the old Black Maw mine. We're going to be trapped." The Black Maw mine. Sterling's blood ran cold. He remembered the stories. A silver mine that had been abandoned decades ago after a series of catastrophic collapses. They said it was cursed, that the mountain itself was unstable. They were driving straight into a tomb. His desperate gamble had failed. But then an idea sparked in his weary mind. A long shot. A terrible, dangerous idea. But it was the only one they had left. "The mine shafts," he said through gritted teeth, the effort of speaking almost too much. "Do they connect to anything? Are there other tunnels? Other exits?" Maggie's eyes widened in the gloom. There's an old ventilation passage. My grandfather used to talk about it. It's supposed to lead to the other side of the mountain, but it was sealed up years ago. They said it was too unstable, that the whole section could come down if you so much as breathed on it. "Is it more dangerous than staying here?" Sterling asked. As if to answer his question, a rifle shot cracked through the canyon, the bullet ricocheting off the rock wall just inches from Maggie's head with a high-pitched whine. The posse was getting closer, and their patience was wearing thin. Up ahead, a dark opening appeared in the canyon wall, a black, gaping mouth partially hidden by a tangle of fallen trees and overgrown brush. The mine entrance. Sterling urged the horses forward, driving the wagon as close as he dared before the path became completely impassable. "We go on foot from here," he grunted, practically falling from the driver's seat. His legs gave way, and he would have collapsed if Maggie hadn't been there to catch him, her surprising strength holding him steady. "You're bleeding too much," she said, her voice thick with a fear that was entirely for him. "You need a doctor. You can't go in there." "I'll be fine," he lied, tasting blood in his mouth. "Getting you safe is all that matters. The rest can wait." He grabbed an old oil lantern from the back of the wagon, struck a match with a trembling hand, and lit the wick. The small, flickering flame pushed back the oppressive darkness, casting long, dancing shadows that made the mine entrance look like the throat of some great beast. The air that drifted out was cold and musty, carrying the smell of damp earth, decay, and something else. Something that smelled like old sorrows. They scrambled inside just as the posse rounded the final bend. "They went into the mine!" a voice shouted from the canyon. "Hold up!" Sheriff Langston's voice commanded. "That place is a death trap. The whole thing could come down on our heads." "I don't care about safe," Amos roared, his voice echoing eerily in the tunnel. "My daughter is in there with a kidnapper. We're going in." "This way," Maggie whispered, taking Sterling's hand and leading him deeper into the oppressive blackness. The lantern's weak light revealed a maze of rotting timber support beams and treacherous, dark pits that dropped away into nothingness. Every step was a gamble. They were a few hundred yards in when Maggie stopped, pointing to what looked like a solid rock wall. But as Sterling raised the lantern, he saw it, a narrow fissure, a crack in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "That's it," she breathed. "The ventilation passage, if it hasn't collapsed already." The sound of heavy boots crunching on loose rock echoed from the tunnel behind them. The posse was inside the mine, and they were closing in fast. With a sinking feeling, Sterling realized the lantern that was lighting their way was also a beacon for their pursuers. He reached over and snuffed out the flame, plunging them into absolute terrifying darkness. The kind of blackness that feels heavy, like a physical weight on your eyes. "Go," he whispered to Maggie, giving her a gentle push toward the opening. "I'm right behind you." He heard her take a deep breath before she slipped into the narrow gap. Sterling followed, the rough rock scraping at his clothes, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest as he contorted his body to fit through. It felt like being buried alive. On the other side, the air was different, fresher. A faint breeze touched his cheek, carrying the scent of pine and open space. They were going to make it. They were almost free. They emerged into a slightly wider passage, the exit visible as a faint gray light in the distance. They had a real chance. But then, from the tunnel behind them, came a sound that froze Sterling's blood in his veins. It wasn't the sound of pursuit. It was the deep, groaning crack of ancient timber finally giving way under immense pressure. It was the sound of the mountain dying. And through it all, Amos's voice, closer than ever, laced with a terrifying, triumphant madness. "I can smell your fear, daughter. Did you think you could hide from me in the dark? The dark is my home. It's where I keep my secrets." Then came a deafening roar like thunder as the narrow passage they had just squeezed through collapsed in on itself. A catastrophic avalanche of rock, and timber, and 10,000 tons of earth. The ground shook violently, throwing them both to the floor. The explosion of dust and displaced air blasted past them, extinguishing their pursuers' lanterns and sealing the tunnel completely. They were safe from pursuit, but the collapse hadn't stopped. The entire mine was coming apart. The groaning and cracking was all around them now, the very rock seeming to scream in agony. Behind them, in the darkness of the main tunnel, they could hear the panicked shouts of the posse as they scrambled for the exit. And trapped in the collapsed section, caught in the tomb he had inadvertently created, was Amos Thatcher. His final, enraged roar was cut short by the crushing finality of the mountain reclaiming its own. Sterling and Maggie didn't wait. They scrambled toward the light, stumbling over loose rock as the tunnel groaned and shifted around them. They burst out of the mine's exit and into the clean, crisp air of the mountainside, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding. They were on the other side of the mountain, looking down on a different valley, a different world. It was over. He couldn't reach them anymore. Sterling's strength finally gave out. His legs buckled, and he slumped against a large boulder, the world spinning in a gray haze. The blood loss and the sheer exhaustion had finally caught up to him. He was finding it hard to breathe, hard to think, but he forced himself to focus on Maggie's face. She was kneeling beside him, her expression a mixture of terror and profound concern. In the clear, unfiltered light of the afternoon sun, he could see her properly for the first time. And he realized something. She was right. Her father had been right about one thing. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way people expected. Her features were too strong, too severe. Her face was a map of hardship and sorrow. And yet, he had never seen anyone more beautiful in his entire life. Her strength, her resilience, the stubborn spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. That was true beauty. "You were wrong, you know," he managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper, "about what you said, about being ugly." Her hand went to her cheek, a gesture of ingrained shame. "You don't have to say that. You don't have to lie to make me feel better." "Not lying," he insisted, reaching out, his hand finding hers. He squeezed it weakly. "Real ugly. Real ugly is a man who chains up his own child because he's afraid, because he's weak. Ugly is a heart so full of poison that it spills out and tries to ruin everything it touches." He looked into her eyes. "Beauty isn't about what's on your face, Maggie. It's about what's in your heart. And your heart is strong." Tears welled in her eyes and traced paths down her dusty cheeks. But for the first time, he could see they were not tears of pain or fear. They were tears of release. What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Even if they believe us, what do we do?" "We," Sterling said, his voice fading, "we'll figure it out. Together." He managed a weak smile. He had meant what he said. She was worth fighting for. She was worth everything. His vision started to fade to black. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Maggie's face, leaning over him, her expression one of fierce determination. The last thing he heard was her voice, no longer the whisper of a victim, but the clear, strong voice of a survivor. "Hold on, Sterling. Just hold on. It's my turn to save you." And as riders from the next town over, drawn by the sound of the mountain collapsing, crested the hill, that's exactly what they found. A young woman, battered but unbroken, refusing to leave the side of the wounded man who had set her free. The story was far from over, but a new chapter had just begun. A chapter that would be written not in fear and darkness, but in courage and light. And as for the secrets of the Black Maw Mine, well, when Sheriff Langston and the surviving members of his posse finally stumbled out, covered in dust and shame, they had a story to tell. A story that cleared Sterling's name and condemned Amos Thatcher to an eternity in the tomb he'd dug for himself. But they left one part out. They never told anyone what else they found down there in the dark. The crude altars, the strange, unsettling symbols carved into the rock walls, the personal effects of at least a half-dozen other travelers who had gone missing in this valley over the years. Some secrets, they decided, were better left buried with the dead. But Maggie knew. And Sterling, once he recovered, would know too. They had survived more than just a cruel father. They had survived a darkness that ran much deeper. And in surviving it together, they found something they never expected, a future. If you were moved by this story of incredible bravery and the fight for freedom, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel bring more stories like this to light. And let me know in the comments below, what do you think was the most courageous thing Sterling did? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.